I'm a minor celebrity.
He also recently did an interview for the IBF podcast that's also on YouTube. And he did an article in Foresight, which let me just see if you can see that here. Recent issue of Foresight that I want to bring your attention to. And he also contributed a piece to a recent collection, a business forecasting collection on the emerging role of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And we are happy to be going to be sending out a copy of this book to our favorite participant from this webinar, from this fireside chat. So we encourage you all to bring your questions and comments and really engage in this presentation as much as possible, because it's unscripted. So who knows where this is going to go, hopefully not straight into the gutter, but I don't think that'll happen with a guy as reputable as Jonathon here leading the way. So
Carolyn, if you want to win the book, it's got to be softball questions.
So with that, Jonathon, let me turn it over to you to maybe kick it off with a little bit of discussion about your organization maybe and in the background on the topic.
Sure. Yeah, so the idea today, folks, is a fireside chat, not another webinar. So I think this is one of the remaining 3 slides that we're going to have, and that's just sort of to set up the conversation. Because I think for a lot of people, exactly what is behavioral economics as a subset of behavioral science, and what does that mean with respect to supply chain decision making and demand planning in particular, is still sort of a poorly understood or sometimes nebulous topic. And what led us as an organization to behavioral economics is a real desire to understand what levers we had at our disposal to make real world impact in both demand planning and the rest of supply chain decision making. And what I mean by real world impact is there's a lot of technologies, for instance, a lot of frameworks that with good reason get a lot of attention. I'm not going to call them out because I don't want to sound like I'm not a proponent of them, because I think judiciously applied, many of these frameworks and technologies can add a ton of value. But in many cases, what you see published in purely academic journals and what you see as results in primarily academic competitions don't always translate well. And Mike talks about us meeting in 2006, and I think that's right, it was 2005 or 2006. It was a conference we were both attending and speaking at. And I remember coming back from that conference really excited about a lot of the things that I'd seen there, and began to try to put them into practice in the organization I was working in the time. And after several months of, let's say, lackluster results, being convinced at first that I must have done something wrong, and then double checking all my steps, realizing this doesn't look like it did in that conference room setting. And that's sort of been the approach ever since then. Understand the state of the art, understand what the latest and greatest theories and technologies and frameworks are, but most important, understand what really moves the needle in the real world. And one of the things that we kept coming back to was, and Paul Goodwin, who's also on the board with Mike Gilliland at the IIF, and Carolyn, has done a lot of research over a couple of decades on this topic. One of the things we came back to was a lot of these great forecasting and demand planning processes driven by multi-million-dollar technological implementations, driven by thousands of work hours of implementation, were ultimately undermined by the fingers that got onto them after the fact. Which isn't to say that human input or adjustments are always bad. It's just that they often are. And what we really wanted to understand was, in a setting where we can no longer rely on, especially during COVID, purely autoregressive or time series methods, that is, when history is no longer a great predictor of the future, how can we integrate these human judgments, these human insights in such a way that we don't bring along with them all of these downsides that researchers like Goodwin have identified over the years? And one of the big answers to that is this question of behavioral economics. So in a nutshell, the gentleman with the luscious hair on the top left of this slide is Adam Smith, who most of you will know as essentially the father of neoclassical economics. And in The Wealth of Nations that he wrote in 1776, which basically gave birth to this entire school of economic theory, the core tenets, if I can be so crude as to distill down such an important work into 3 bullets, are when people are faced with clear decisions, they're going to choose the option that has the highest utility or value to them. And to be clear, utility is not always the highest dollar value or monetary value. There's multiple ways of defining utility, but irrespective of what method you use, people are rational and will always choose the decision that benefits them the most. And then based on that, when people are making these decisions, prices get set by the relative availability of supply versus the demand. And in those occasions when, and I loved this as an economics undergrad student, come up with an idea. If the idea doesn't work, it's not that the idea doesn't work, it's that people are behaving irrationally. So when people don't fit this model, when they're not doing the things that the model predicts, we call them irrational. And this all sounds pretty straightforward, and it's very intuitive in part because we have 2 centuries of history of believing this is the way it works. But the reality is there's way too many data points of irrational behavior to ignore the fact that this might not be a purely generally applicable theory. Down in the bottom right of this slide is Daniel Kahneman, who most of you, if you've heard of him, was best known in popular culture through his book Thinking Fast and Slow, but he'd already won a Nobel Prize by that point, and his seminal research with his collaborator Amos Tversky had begun in the early 1970s. What the 2 of them happened across, not in economics, but in psychology, was the idea that when we're making judgments under a condition of uncertainty, the expectation that we can make lucid, objective, rational decisions quickly goes out the window. And they measured this in a number of different ways, but they found that our capability for estimation, our capability for linear judgment between risk and reward, these are all flawed ideas. We don't have a linear relationship between risk and reward. It's both asymmetric and disproportionate. So we are much more afraid of losing things than we are of earning things, for instance. Our capacity for mental estimation is, in the best of conditions, flawed, and in conditions of uncertainty, especially flawed. Richard Thaler, who also won a Nobel Prize in economics, picked up on their work in the early 80s and found even further many examples of how bad we are at estimating things in the future. So essentially, the bottom line is, no matter how rational we think we are, there are certain innate flaws in the way that humans make judgments in uncertainty that give rise to these various heuristic processes and biases. What that means for demand planning and supply chain decision-making in general is, even when we think we're making objective choices, the second at which humans get involved in the process, we threaten to undo the good work that unbiased, automated, computer-based processes have made. However, the crux is, when we're in a situation like we are now, where we can't use a lot of history, we need to find a way to integrate this judgment but mitigate the effect of biases. So one last comment, and then I'm going to stop sharing the slides until we get to some strategies for mitigation later that Mike is going to lead. For those of you who are unaware of Tversky and Kahneman's work, there's a ton of research. There's a ton of follow-up research from other people, but if we had to, again, do them the gross disservice of distilling all their work into one slide and 3 bullets, essentially it boils down to a set of 3 mental shortcuts that we've developed evolutionarily to benefit us, which unfortunately make us pretty bad at objective decision making. The reason we have these heuristic processes or these mental shortcuts in place is because we make on average about 30 to 35,000 decisions a day. And if we had to stop and really consider every single decision on its own merit, we would be deadlocked. We wouldn't make any decisions. And going back further in the evolutionary process, if a tiger is jumping out of the jungle and we're stopping to consider the various options we have at our disposal, we're eaten by a tiger. So that instinctive heuristic process where we quickly react serves us very well sometimes. But when it comes to making objective decisions about abstract ideas like the future, like a forecast, we're not great. These heuristic processes, the 3 of them, are representativeness, where our brain has a database of all the experiences we've had before. And when we see a new situation, it says, this looks like something I've seen before. So rather than deeply considering this, I'm going to react in the same way I did successfully last time I saw this. That's the representativeness heuristic. The availability heuristic is a heuristic that says, if I was able to recall this quickly, it's probably important. So if I'm considering what various, for instance, causes of death are, I'm probably going to recall the things I've been hearing about in the news most frequently, rather than objectively what the real causes of death were. This is actually one of the examples that Tversky and Kahneman came up with in their 1974 study. And the final, adjustment and anchoring, which actually came up not in the study that's quoted here at the bottom of the slide, but in a later study in 1979, shows us what effect anchors and adjustments can have on objectivity. So in other words, if we come with a preconceived notion of an outcome, oftentimes it's very difficult to push us off of that preconceived notion, even when we're given additional useful information. From these 3 heuristics, there are a host of unconscious biases. And the key here is that they're unconscious. Mike gave reference earlier to work we've done recently, and we worked with a number of big multinationals gauging what degree of unconscious bias their planners had, and it was startling. I mean, we knew it was going to be there, but I mean, north of 80% of people had significant unconscious biases in a number of areas, and we're talking about professional demand planners. So the question isn't, do I have them? Because statistically you do. The question is, what do I do about getting the benefit of human judgment into a process without degrading it with all these biases? So having given that, well, maybe not as quick as Mike wanted, but very quick summary of behavioral economics, let's kick off the chat.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, you're welcome to go as long as you want. Just a couple things. First, regarding the chat, feel free to put your questions within the chat box, or we want to try to open this up so you can just come on and speak to us as well. Fire up your camera if you want to as well. A couple of other, I think, things we may be familiar with or heard of, something called confirmation bias and something called the cluster illusion. Can you just briefly go through those 2?
Sure. So both of these, confirmation bias is a subset of the adjustment and anchoring effect, and cluster illusion is a subset of the representativeness heuristic. These are really interesting and unfortunately highly prevalent biases in demand planners. Confirmation bias is that bias that says, once I've got an idea in my head about what the conclusion is, Carolyn's got a question, how do I define? I'm not going to tell you how I define it, Carolyn. I'm going to defer to the Nobel laureate, and I'll tell you how he defines it in a moment. Confirmation bias is that bias that says, I've got this idea about how this looks or what it should be, and now every piece of information that I get from this point forward, I'm going to use selectively to reinforce this belief. So a great example of confirmation bias was in the 1986 Challenger disaster. You had a bunch of really smart people, unfortunately, all from the same background, which is itself a form of bias. That's groupthink bias, who had come to the conclusion that Challenger should launch. So any of the additional information they were receiving, they were explaining away rather than investigating whether or not, of its own merit, this should change their viewpoint. It's a very insidious type of bias because, to Carolyn's question, which I'll answer presently, we're not aware of it happening. It's happening in the background. We're not consciously choosing to have confirmation bias. But an easy check for it is if we've got a conclusion and we're being presented an opposing piece of information, if we're dismissing that piece of information out of hand rather than considering it, it's a pretty fair bet we've got confirmation bias. Cluster illusion is this other type of bias, again, a subset of the representativeness heuristic, where our brain thinks it has seen something like this before, but it really hasn't. Cluster illusion is that bias where, especially in people who were asking to identify patterns, which is demand planners, we are tricked into believing there are patterns in stochastic data, or we miss patterns where there are patterns. And something like 80% of people that we looked at exhibited some degree of cluster illusion bias. So when presented completely stochastic data, they were highly certain they had identified patterns in that data. This is a great example, Mike, of where computers should definitely do the work. There's the place for human judgment. There is a place, and Goodwin has shown this, apart from showing why there's downsides to it as well. But in identifying objective patterns in data, a computer is always going to do it better than a person. So to Carolyn's question about unconscious bias, it's a fraught topic because it's become conflated with that social form of bias that is widely discussed right now. And I'm talking about something distinct, but not entirely unrelated from that. Kahneman and Tversky defined their sets of heuristics and biases as unconscious because a conscious bias would be a bias we are knowingly bringing to a decision-making process, whereas unconscious bias exists outside, sort of in the periphery of our consciousness. We think we're making an objective decision. We think we're making an objective estimation, but we have a bias or a subset of these heuristics baked into our thought process, which we are completely unaware of, that is skewing us away from what otherwise purely objective decision-making would be. I hope that satisfies you. We've had some long topics on exactly what is bias. And again, because we're talking about something that is intangible, it gets a little bit tricky to come up with a very tangible decision. But essentially, you're not aware of the bias, that makes it unconscious.
And there can also be really, you call them conscious biases in organizations.
Oh, absolutely.
In forecasting processes.
Absolutely.
You have each process participant in the process may have some political or personal agenda out there to drive the forecast in one direction or another. I think we can characterize those pretty as conscious. For example, you're someone who's trying to drive down inventories because that's the metric you're on. You may want to push the forecast down to justify keeping lower levels of inventory. And of course, things on the flip side. On the other hand, a marketing or salesperson may have reason to try to push people to achieve higher sales or reach a budget that we're falling short of. And so therefore, force upon the process this really consciously biased forecast or impact to drive it higher.
Yeah, exactly right.
Your study is, I think, that you've done so far, and I understand you're also continuing with some follow-ups on that as well because of the amount of interest it's gained and really showing that these things, I guess taking the academic, the kind of theory about these things and showing they really do impact. They're really happening out there in the field, especially when it comes to forecasting and demand planning.
Yeah, that's what's particularly exciting about it. I mean, this is an area that, I mean, intellectually, it can be very interesting. But what does it mean in real life? And that's for us ultimately always the question after going off in one of these new directions. And the follow-up work that we've done with some of the biggest participants like Dell Technologies and Heineken a year later is that once you've identified these types of biases, and once you put some of the mitigation frameworks in place, you can see a tangible improvement in the key forecasting metrics. And that's ultimately what it's all about. So I want to just underline for everyone that although we're talking about over 100 types of unconscious bias, all stemming from these same heuristic processes, and we've got a guy on our team who's a behavioral scientist from Duke, which is right now getting a lot of notoriety thanks to the questionable research practices of Dan Ariely, or allegedly questionable research processes of Dan Ariely. He, in his view, I mean, 100 biases is kind of like cutting it much thinner than you need to. There's basically like 10 to 20 really big ones that matter, and then you're just slicing it into different flavors. But the bottom line is we've got them, and when you start to measure them and you start to put mitigation frameworks in place, you can fix them. Now, there's many organizations that unwittingly or unaware already have mitigation frameworks in place, like forecast value add, which Mike will talk about shortly. A great way to identify bias at its sources and take steps to mitigate it. Decision trees and decision-making frameworks to reduce the number of times that humans intervene into processes where they shouldn't. This is another great intervention technique, and you don't need to really understand behavioral science to see the positive benefit of it. But measuring the types of bias in planners is probably the easiest and simplest way to begin to mitigate it, because you can't really fix what you haven't measured in the first place.
Yep, so we've kind of talked about the theory, we've talked about the evidence that these things are really occurring, and now we're moving on to the mitigation of these. What can an organization do not only make themselves aware of what's really happening in their forecasting process, and what ways are there to then address those?
Maybe, Mike, before I pop up your FVA slide, got a question from Andrea that I'm going to read out because it's lengthy. I'm not going to try to distill this on the fly, Andrea. So the question is this: we know that taking decisions under uncertainty, and especially when things are going bad, creates bias. I would like to know, to what extent is government driving bias with its policies at this stage? If we think, for example, about the way New Zealand has gone versus Sweden in handling the academic, how do we incorporate this into our forecasting? Okay, so this is another, I'll call it fraught question, because it really depends on what side of, or if you even believe there is a debate, that puts you into one camp, and if you don't, that puts you into another. But I'll say this: I think what you're driving at here is sort of coming back to one of the cruxes of Carolyn's question, which is that distinction between conscious bias and unconscious bias, or inadvertent bias and unconscious bias. So I'll definitely agree that government policy is creating repercussions, and in demand planning, we sometimes call that artificial volatility or artificial noise, rather than that naturally occurring stuff that is stochastic. But government policy versus unconscious bias, to me, is two different things. Unconscious bias are the biases that we carry with us as the result of the way that our decision making has evolved, and that's not something that can be rewired as a result of current events. What can be rewired are things like the framing effect, or our responsiveness to current events through the availability heuristic. So if we get inundated with a media message or government message, absolutely it can impact our decision making, and absolutely there is a difference in approach to COVID response between New Zealand and between Sweden. But I think and I haven't answered your question at all yet. I think that the big lesson for what we incorporate into our forecasting is basically the awareness that we are constantly being bombarded by messaging that at some level, either conscious or unconscious, can impact the otherwise objectivity of our decision making. And when we're hearing a lot of messaging, it's really important to take a step back and consciously evaluate the decision that's being made in and of its own merit to the extent possible. One of the things that Kahneman talks about in Thinking Fast and Slow, for those of you who've read it, you'll recognize System 1 and System 2. Again, the behavioral scientist we have on our team opposes this idea very strenuously. And indeed, even Kahneman says there aren't discrete systems in the brain. This is just a way for us to understand these two different ways of thinking. But System 1 is that responsive, reactive, using all these, or probably being subject to all these unconscious biases to a greater extent because we're reflexive. System 2 is consciously stepping back, consciously evaluating as many different viewpoints or pieces of information as possible, and as a result, mitigating to some extent the effect of the unconscious biases that arise from reflexive decision making. And that's what really has to, happen here. So let me share the slide so Mike can talk about forecast value add, which is probably one of the most effective and easiest to implement frameworks to begin to mitigate the downside of integrating human judgment.
Thanks, Jonathan. We're all familiar with the mindset that the more elaborate forecasting process we can create, the better it's going to be, the more touch points so people can add their, quote, management intelligence to the forecast. The problem with these, and I've been in this, started in my forecasting career in 1985, so I've been involved in this since probably before many of you were born. The problem with this mindset is it doesn't at all take a critical look. It assumes all of these steps and processes are making the forecast better, but using the traditional performance metrics, we never really know that. We may measure the MAPE or other metric of the final forecast, but we don't know what should, how good should we be? And is that actually any better than doing nothing and just using a naive forecast like the no change model, using your last observation as the future forecast? So if we look at a typical business forecasting process as this top line here, your data feeds into your software, generates what we refer to as the statistical forecast coming out of the software. An analyst may review and override it. There may be a collaboration or consensus process going on where people from all over the organization and finance and sales and marketing and operations and so on review and provide their adjustments to it. Then often there's this final step where a division president or CEO or general manager gets this final review of the number and can make a final change to it. So it all sounds well and good, but presumably people are smarter and smarter as we're going up this chain of overrides. Problem is when you start to actually look at that and measure the performance at each of these steps, you may be shocked to find these steps aren't always making it better. In fact, they're very often making the forecast worse or having no effect at all, showing you're just completely wasting your time. So forecast value added analysis is just kind of a concept, a method, a simple method of essentially applying basic science to the forecasting process. So we have a natural placebo to compare this forecasting process to, and that's the naive forecast. So in FVA, we would look at, how did the naive forecast do against your historical data? How did the stat forecast do, the analyst override, the consensus, the final override? And therefore we get a sense, do these steps, are they improving the process, or are they just making it worse or entirely a waste of time and having no effect at all? So it's very analogous to a drug test. You've got a new drug or a medical treatment. You're testing to see if it has a positive effect. You start with the null hypothesis that all this work you're doing has no effect, and then measure, track it over some time, measure it, and see what you're finding out. And that way, by identifying the problems and often identifying chronic biases among the participants or steps in the process, you can go about correcting those or simply streamlining the process and eliminating those steps. You may find that given the nature of your data, the statistical forecast does perfectly well with that. And you're just not going to be able to get much improvement by human effort. Other cases, for example, when you have a new product or you really have no or very little historical information to go on where a statistical model is going to struggle with, then you may rely more on judgment. And then while you still want to be conscious of the biases, you do have some hope of getting some improvement out of that. The main thing with FVA is just awareness that the traditional metrics like a MAPE is not going to tell you really anything, the important things you need to know. It tells you the accuracy of the ultimate forecast, but nothing about the efficiency or effectiveness of your step.
Yeah, what I say sometimes, Mike, is MAPE or root mean squared error, whatever error metric you're using, tells you the what, but not the why. And FVA really gets to more of the meat of the why.
So there is a lot of literature over the last 20 years on this topic, case studies people have published and instances. For example, Jonathon had communicated to me years ago when he worked in the Canadian tire industry of a situation where he was tracking this, and from a role in a financial position, he found that there actually was very slight improvement in accuracy through the process. But when you compared that to the cost of all the management time that it went into it, it was just kind of a wash. You think, is there any, is this worth the effort if we're just getting a tiny improvement? The other thing with tiny improvements and tiny adjustments in forecasts is, why bother? Even if you can demonstrate adjustment, you make a small adjustment, is it going to change any decisions or actions that are going to be made? If not, you're simply wasting your time. So maybe one piece of advice that comes out a lot of this and in some of the studies on it, the Files and Goodwin studies and so on, is that it's probably a best chance if there's good reason to make a big adjustment, that may mean there's a better chance that that's going to be value adding versus these tiny adjustments. Also, negative adjustments tend to be more value adding by some of the research. And the justification reason for this, Files and Goodwin has been speculated on. Well, it's easy enough to boost a forecast. Everybody's happy, pumped up, the number looks better. But you've got to be pretty brave to go into a meeting, drop your forecast in front of everybody, because there are probably going to be some angry people who are not going to like to hear that kind of a news and push back pretty strongly against it. So maybe you only do downward, especially large downward forecasts, when you've got very good reason to do that. Just a couple other points in line of this forecast adjustment of applying judgment to forecasts is the idea of parsimonious intervention. Goodwin has talked about this. Really just wait till you've got good reason to make an adjustment. One way software companies could possibly help in doing this, it's been kind of kicked around. I haven't seen it implemented anywhere, but make it harder to make an adjustment. Provide, for example, require reasons, a reason code or some kind of a reason explanation be put in when you're making a forecast. If nothing else, this will take maybe a lazier person who doesn't want to go and make that effort. It'll prevent them from making an adjustment that they maybe shouldn't be making in the first place. So it's an interesting topic. It's exciting to see a lot of the research that's been going into this and the continuing interest in the role of judgment in forecasting, and the overall bigger picture about improving the overall forecasting process, the usage of forecasts in organizations. And this is a subject of current research project led by Spiros Makrodakis, involving a team of academics and practitioners, myself, one of them included in this, is, we've got all this research, we've got the M competitions and so on. They're demonstrating that we are seeing methods now that are demonstrating improvements versus traditional methods in forecasting. Now, they may be costly and complex to implement these new methods, but there is potential for improvement. And yet the practice of business forecasting largely seems to have been stagnant. Again, 35 years ago was my first role in forecasting, and the same mistakes I was making 35 years ago, we're still seeing today. We haven't yet figured out how to pass along this tribal knowledge or whatever it is to improve the process to the degree that it should be. And that's the objective of this newer research on the UFO project, the usage of forecasting in organizations.
Mike, we've got a couple of questions that have popped up, and I'm going to, Peter, your question is longer, so I'm going to answer it second. So Chip was asking, are there ways to explicitly model the effects of biases to make them more visible and therefore more amenable to counteracting their effects? And the short answer is absolutely yes. This was the point of the work that Heineken initially had sponsored us to do. So the idea is our planners are biased. Tell us what effect or to what extent they're biased and what effect those biases are having on the forecasting process, and that'll help us sell whatever the medicine afterwards is. And that's exactly how the process went. They imagined they were having geographic differences in biases, and didn't really want to say, for obvious reasons, that this division is crap at forecasting versus that one. So they brought someone from the outside to come in and model this scientifically. And yeah, the study we did with them, which incidentally is available for free online if you're interested in doing it and seeing what your biases look like. We measured for 16 bias types, and we measured by magnitude as well. So as a result of that, we could say, listen, the planning group that has these really big anchor biases, really big directional biases, also corresponds to the group that has the lowest forecasting performance. So if we can theoretically clean up some of these unconscious biases, it'll have a knock-on effect on forecast performance, and that's what we saw over time. Peter's question was, Mike, while you were explaining the FEA process, is the process sequential? That is to say, do analysts look at model forecasts, or is it parallel? I'll answer for Mike and say, Peter, it depends. Really, the beauty of FEA is it can be adapted to any forecast process. The point is you break down your process into the constituent buckets and then model afterwards what the incremental effect of each of these input types was. But the second part of Peter's question is, or this becomes a statement now. One of the findings from the US government-funded hybrid forecasting competition is that the model is typically more accurate when human forecasts are close to it, but humans are more accurate when there's a broad disparity. And that's absolutely the case. That gets into a whole other topic that we don't unfortunately have time to explore fully in the next 15 minutes. But we've talked a bit about individual biases today, but there's a huge topic to be explored on group biases as well. Both those conscious organizational biases that Mike made reference to, where in a lot of organizations, there's a lot of upward pressure on forecasts. So it's much easier to make upward adjustments. It's much tougher to sell the downward ones. But unconscious group biases as well, like in-group bias, where because we're tribal, we tend to like to work with people who think like us and don't make it difficult to make decisions. As well as groupthink, where the dynamic of a particular group pulls us all along in the same direction, again, causing us to ignore counter pieces of information that could be useful. The reason, like Peter says, that there's much more value, and this has been observed over multiple decades of research, when there's a broad disparity, the Delphi method, for instance, tries to encourage that, is precisely because when you've got disparity, you are forced to acknowledge varying viewpoints, and it forces you, or it nudges you at least, away from those confirmation biases and anchoring biases to be open to a broader set of information and make a more fully formed decision. Carolyn is asking, did the survey look at differences in the forecasting process and the effect on bias of, so absolutely, Carolyn, yes. That's one of the critical pieces. And to follow on Mike's comments earlier about Goodwin's research on the benefit of positive versus negative adjustments, we were aware of that research going into our work, and we were, I was going to say satisfied, but maybe also relieved to find that the result of our research corroborated it. It let us know we were on at least stable ground. And one of the reasons for that, in addition to what Mike was saying, is, I believe, also this asymmetric and nonlinear relationship between risk and reward that Kahneman and Tversky identified in 1973 or 1974. We're much more afraid of loss than we are motivated by gain. And consequently, we're much more afraid of what might happen with a downward adjustment in a forecast than we are in recognizing the upside effect. So it takes a lot more for a forecaster to push the button on a negative adjustment than a positive adjustment. Our research with these organizations found the exact same thing. Forecasters were 3 times as likely to make upward adjustments than downward adjustments. And though the benefit of those adjustments was often negative. In other words, they undermined the value of the forecast.
Hey, just a quick, can
Go
I
ahead.
quick follow up on Peter's question? Yes, in terms of doing FEA, some organizations, as Jonathon mentioned, have a very sequential process where they're step by step, the stat forecast, an analyst override, consensus, executive override, that sort of thing. In which case you can do an FEA analysis step by step, see what the incremental improvements are. Other organizations, as you mentioned, everything kind of goes in and throws in at once and essentially have maybe your stat forecast and then a final adjusted forecast, in which case your FEA would just be doing those comparisons. And in regard to this, I think there's an analogy here in the second part of your question, or some parallel here to the idea of combining models, combining statistical models, the diversity of opinion and so on. It's pretty well established that combining relevant models will perform better than any single model. And that performance actually is enhanced when there's a good diversity of models here, kind of a triangulation effect of getting different perspectives of the same data, and then just simply averaging them tends to give a better forecast than picking any single particular. Yeah, so I think that's what, even though we're talking about mostly judgment here today, there is that parallel to the actual statistical modeling.
Absolutely, Mike. And even for the people who have been popping the champagne on machine learning finally with the results of the M5 competition, because they've been waiting for years to finally say, hey, we know eventually this is going to beat the simple models. Again, if you parse the results, yes, the top performing models incorporated machine learning, but all of the models that were exclusively driven by machine learning were much worse than the simple models. The models that won were all hybrid models that included elements of machine learning, but included multiple sources of the traditional time series methods as well. And absolutely, the research shows that when you can judiciously integrate human judgment, over time, it generally outperforms an exclusively data-driven forecast. And Peter has given a follow-up to his original question, just a point of clarity, that he was referring to the disparity between human forecasts and model forecasts, and when they vary greatly, humans are usually right. And that again comes back to the idea that we've all been talking about earlier, which is when you get a demand planner to the point where they're willing to go on record with a big adjustment, they probably know something. It's these little incremental adjustments that really don't mean a whole lot, that are oftentimes really, I'm trying to think of a nicer way to say it, but it's essentially a waste of time. I mean, the goal in business forecasting, unlike academic forecasting, is not forecasting perfection. It's making more money. So if it's costing me more money to get an additional point of accuracy, but that point of accuracy isn't netting me more money than it cost, it's bad business. So sometimes you have to live with, knowing you probably are giving up a little bit of accuracy, because to get it defeats the purpose of why you're business forecasting.
Yeah, Tom Wallace and Bob Stahl put it in their book many years ago. You're trying to get the number in a ballpark, get a number that's good enough to help make a good decision. It's not worth the trouble of trying to squeeze out those extra little fractions of percentage points of accuracy. It's simply not worth it. Hey, I wanted to bring you everyone some good news on behalf of Pam Stroud here, the business director of IIF and Foresight Management. She is going to let us send out a PDF of Jonathon's article from the recent issue of Foresight. So everyone in this will get a copy of that. And I also want to point out my forecast value added article is available for free download on the IIF website. So again, go into forecasters.org/foresight and you can find your way around and download that article too. So two of the kind of basic articles and things we've talked about today, you can get access to for free, as well as Jonathon's YouTube videos.
That I was previously unaware of. So some good questions so far. Thanks, and thank you, Catherine, for pumping up a distribution on my my article on LinkedIn regarding reducing human bias. We still have time for a few more questions. Unfortunately, it's a big topic and very difficult to distill down very, very quickly. But while you're all ruminating and thinking of the last few questions that we can handle in the last 8 minutes, I want to emphasize again that despite the fact that we've got conclusive evidence that shows we're all biased, and none of us, or very few of us, are aware of the full extent to which our decision-making processes are flawed, there's also an equally large body of research that shows when we're aware of these biases and when we choose our spots to get involved in the forecasting process with human judgment, we can improve the value of the forecast. And especially for the last year and a half, where for many organizations, historic models are out the window because their consumers are now acting very differently than they did. There's, especially in these times, a need to integrate human judgment. So there's tons of upside potential when we know something that's different about the future, when we know something that doesn't look like the past. It's just we get even more performance out of it when we, at the same time, identify the extent to which we have biases that are going to be coming along with that judgment. Oh, we have we have a comment and a question. Okay, so Catherine is saying that Nick Reich is at UMass Amherst doing the CDC COVID ensemble models, but ensemble models really struggle with major chain. Yeah, this is definitely a distinct question separate from bias, but in fairness, we did get off the bias track a little bit for a few minutes earlier. That's interesting. I'm going to follow that up after the call. And Carolyn is asking, do we have a recommendation about the best way to measure bias in our forecasts? Well, I mean, there's forecast bias and there's bias in judgment. And forecast bias is a pretty well-established and easy one. I'm not going to jump into the debate on the value of relative error metrics, but bias in a forecast is typically measured by that percent error, and you're looking at the directionality of it. But I think your question is probably more around the extent to which, and clarify for me if I'm wrong, the extent to which our unconscious biases are impacting our forecasts. And if that's the question, again, the bias, the unconscious bias measuring assessment that we've developed over the last couple of years is free. It's online, and it's continuing to evolve, and we're trying to find a way to make it even simpler and effective. But for anyone that's interested in measuring their bias or their team's bias, it's, I'm pretty sure, available on our website for free. And if it's not there, if you can't find it, feel free to send me an email and I'll send you a link to it, because it's essentially aggregated the the models for testing that Kahneman, Tversky, and Thaler used in their original papers in 74, 79, and 84. We've tweaked the language a little bit and made it more demand planning specific, but essentially it allows you to go through the same tests that they performed on their test subjects back when they were doing this research and seeing what the result is. And now Peter is saying that, oh, actually everyone can read this. I don't need to read it out.
Hey, Jonathan, I was thinking if you want to put your NorthFind slide up.
Oh, my email address. Yeah, good idea.
We kind of skipped that. You can show that to everyone.
Just give me a second. Okay. Yeah, by all means, if you can't find the link to the study, then send me an email. I'll get you a link to it, and we can usually turn around your results in 24, 48 hours. The short answer, Carolyn, is I wish there was an even easier way to test for the unconscious bias types in planners, but we're testing for a number of different bias types, and in addition, there's a personality component that we're testing for as well. So it's not as easy as, you know, sending out a 10 question questionnaire by PDF and you run through it and you know the answer. It's but we're working at simplifying it to the extent that that's possible.
Can I just make a comment, Jonathan, too? It seems to me that the role of the demand planner in the organization is really important in all of this consideration. In addition to the process, what role, what power, what authority does a demand planner have in the process to use what they think is best? And then, of course, they have to be concerned if they are biased, as we should. But in some processes, they have more discretion on what the forecasts should be from their training and experience as a forecaster, and there are fewer overrides that are in the process, which I think generally makes the forecast better.
Yeah, absolutely the case. That gets to sort of more a meta type of question, which is, do organizations in general really understand what they should be asking of a demand planner, or what should a demand planner be doing? And that's a fundamental mistake that some organizations make. But it's a point very well taken, Carolyn. Thank you.
And I think that that's really critical into the success of the whole process, how leadership sees the role and how they give the proper discretion to that role once they've hired the person.
Yep, that's true.
Thank you for letting me comment.
Hey, I think we're about at the top of the hour. So again, feel free to reach out to Jonathan or me with any further questions or comments. We appreciate your attendance today. It's been great to have you and all the engagement here at the end. It was just what we were hoping for. And I don't think we have anything yet scheduled for the next in the Foresight webinar series, but please keep an eye out for that. That will be announced as we line up our next topics. And any of you who have, I would say, topics that you are interested in presenting and maybe do something for yourself or for your company in the webinar series, again, reach out to me, reach out to Pam Stroud, and we'll work with you. I think we're not too bad to work with, are we, Jonathan and Tiffany?
No, Len's tougher than you, but
Okay.
in general, it's an easy organization to work with.
Okay, great. Edward, thank you. Thank you all. I guess we'll sign off for now, and around the world.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for having this.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.